So there are several hormones that need to be activated for puberty to kick in. And during puberty, the follicle stimulating hormone is the main hormone that begins the process of sperm, that helps in beginning the formation of sperm formation, the process of sperm formation. So the main hormone that triggers the formation of sperm is FSH, and luteinizing hormone basically activates the interstitial cells to produce testosterone. Testosterone is the most important product of testes, and it stimulates the development of the male, the reproductive organ. And it causes a sex drive, and it is responsible for secondary sex characteristics like deep voice, increased hair growth, enlarged skeletal muscles, and increased bone densities, etc. Now, both male and females are born with estrogen and testosterone both at birth, but as we grow and develop, males have increased levels of testosterone and not much levels of estrogen. So moving on to the anatomy of the female reproductive system. The female reproductive system basically consists of the ovaries, the duct system, and the external genitalia. Now, if you look at the female reproductive, so this over here is a midsection of the female reproductive system. The main organs that produce eggs are known as ovaries. So the ovaries are responsible for production of something called as oocytes and hormones that take part in the female reproductive system. And the main function of the uterine tube is to transport the eggs, and the uterus is where the fetal development occurs, and the vagina or the birth canal is the canal through which the baby actually exits the womb. And the external genitalia basically constitutes this, which is known as the vulva, which is made up of labium minus and the labius major. And the other accessory organs include the mammary glands that are responsible for producing milk. Now, the ovary itself with a pair of organs is the size of almonds in the upper pelvic region. So each ovary consists of ovarian follicle that contains oocyte, which is a mature egg, and the follicle cell, which is a layer of different cells that surround the oocyte. So if you look at the ovarian follicles, it consists of the primary follicles, which contains a primary oocyte, and just a second. So the ovarian follicle consists of the vesicular or the Graafian follicle, which is a growing follicle within the mature oocyte. And the whole process of ovulation occurs every about 28 days, and the follicle ruptures when the egg is mature and is ready to be ejected out of the ovary. So this process is called ovulation. So the ruptured follicle gets transformed into something called as the corpus luteum. So the process of formation of egg happens in several stages. It begins by a cell known as the primordial follicle, which is not shown over here. Now the primordial follicle is a single layer of cells around the oocyte, and it matures into the primary follicle. Now the primary follicle consists of specialized cells that secrete estrogens, which causes them to mature into the secondary follicle. Now the secondary follicle basically is also known as the antral veil, which contains the antral cavity, and the secondary follicle, also known as the antral follicle, it develops into the Graafian follicle. So this is the secondary follicle, and the Graafian follicle basically mature to form the oocyte, and they are ready to ovulate. So the Graafian follicle basically develops into a mature oocyte, and during the process of ovulation, the Graafian follicle ruptures and it releases the secondary mature oocyte. So this process is known as ovulation. So everything that remains becomes something called as the corpus luteum, and eventually the corpus luteum degrades. Now after the ovulation, the empty follicle that becomes the corpus luteum is actually a very important part, because it secretes several different hormones like progesterone. Now progesterone helps in preparation of the uterine lining. So it prepares the uterus for pregnancy basically. The estrogen work with progesterone, and relaxin relaxes the uterine muscle and the pubic symphysis. Now the relaxins are hormones that are very important during pregnancy. They basically loosen the joints in order to relax the pelvic bone to allow for expansion. And the other hormone that the corpus luteum secretes is known as inhibin. Inhibin basically decreases the secretion of FSH, which is follicle stimulating hormone, and luteinizing hormone. The follicle stimulating hormone basically help trigger the formation of eggs. But if there's no fertilization, again, this is degraded, and we shed the uterine lining, and the process begins by stimulation of FSH for maturation of the primary follicles into oocytes. So once the egg is produced, they pass through the fallopian tube, and the fallopian tube or the uterine tube is a narrow 4-inch tube that extends from the ovary to the uterus. So the first region is known as the infundibulum. So infundibulum is an open funnel-shaped portion near the ovary, and the fimbriae is the finger-like process that help in moving the eggs. And then you have the ampulla. So the ampulla is basically the central region of the tube, and the isthmus is the narrow portion that joins the uterus. Okay, so well, they're not labeled over here, but this is the ampulla, and this over here is the isthmus, which is the narrow portion that joins the uterus. Now the main role of the fimbriae is to sweep the oocytes into the tube. After the oocytes are the mature secondary oocytes, basically the eggs, and they contain something called as the cilia that help in movement along the fallopian tube. The sperm basically reaches the oocyte in the ampulla, and fertilization occurs within 24 hours of ovulation. And after fertilization occurs, the zygote reaches the uterus in about 7 days after ovulation. So the uterus is basically the site of maturation and development of the fetus. It is about 3 inches long and 2 inches wide and about 1 inch thick. It can be divided into the fundus and the body of the cervix, body and the cervix. Cervix basically means the neck. So the cervix of the uterus is basically the neck of the uterus. It's like the cervix of your cervix or the neck of that's right below your head. So interiorly it contains a uterine cavity which can be accessed by a cervical canal. So this region is the cervical canal. This region is the vagina. The vagina is the passageway for birth and also the passageway for menstrual flow and intercourse. So the vagina is a 4-inch long, very muscular organ at the end of the cervix, and it is present in between the urinary bladder and the rectum. The orifice is partially closed by a membrane which is known as the hymen membrane. So the uterus is made up of 3 layers. The endometrium, which is the innermost layer. This is the site of implantation of the fertilized egg. If there's no pregnancy, it sloughs off, which results in the menstrual cycle. And it consists of the myometrium, which is the middle layer of smooth muscle that contracts during labor, and the perimetrium, which is the outermost layer, which is the serous layer. The serous layer protects it from friction and absorbs shock. So the external genitalia basically is what we think of when we think of the reproductive system, and the external genitalia consists of the mons pubis, which is the fatty area covering the external genitalia. This is present right above the pubic bone, specifically the pubic symphysis, and it's covered by pubic hair after puberty, and it consists of the folds or the labia around the vulva. So this is the vulva, and it consists of the labia minora and the labia majora. The labia majora is the hair covered skin that folds, and it encloses the labia minora, which encloses the vestibule. So it also consists of the openings, which is the urethral orifice for urine and the vaginal opening. So the clitoris is similar to the erectile tissue in males. So it consists of a bunch of erectile tissue, and it gets it can get stimulated during the process of sexual intercourse.